Great. Good morning, everyone. I think there's people entering now into our workshop this morning. And we'll get right started as we have quite a bit of content to go through. And thank you so much for joining this workshop. I know there's a lot of great sessions going on at the same time. Probably hard to choose which to attend, but we really appreciate you coming to ours today. So as you can see from the title here, and as you know, we're going to be talking about mobilizing your ICS research using digital media for knowledge translation and integrated knowledge translation. And really today, we're going to try to make this session as interactive as possible, keep you all awake this morning as it is kind of the first session of the day. So I want to very briefly just give a little welcome and touch on our agenda. So we have a great list of speakers for you today. Myself, Ferreira-Legere. I'm a Senior Manager of Public Engagement and Knowledge Translation here at ICES Central. I also have my colleague Sabella, who's a Public Engagement and Knowledge Translation Officer, also at ICES Central. And then we have 4 members of our Public Advisory Council at ICES. We're very fortunate today that they could join us, and they're really going to be providing an insight from a public perspective in terms of what's important to consider when you're creating a digital media strategy. So we have Alakia, Jenny, Pierre, and Dave, who will be speaking throughout the session as well. And then just to touch on our agenda today. So as you can see, again, quite a packed agenda. We'll try to get everything in as much as possible. It would be great to have a full day for this session, but we'll try to squeeze in as much as we can in an hour and 15 minutes. So we'll talk to you a little bit about the difference between knowledge translation versus integrated knowledge translation. You know, what's the difference? We'll talk about digital media strategies that you could use. We'll give you an example of some content considerations for written digital content, and we'll jump into a case study on using a video. We'll wrap it up with talking about dissemination, social media, and plain language, and have some time at the end for question and answers. I won't go into too much detail with these objectives, other than to say we really hope you take away a little bit more understanding about KT and IKT after this session, and also understanding the importance from a public perspective, as well as ways to actually mobilize your research. Kind of before we get into things, I also want to briefly touch on the ICS Public Advisory Council for those of you who may not be familiar with the work that they do. So the ICS Public Advisory Council was actually formed in 2018, and it's made up of members of the public from across Ontario. Really, the council has been quite instrumental in providing the public's voice and provides guidance on many different ICS initiatives and projects. To date, the council consists of about 20 members who now operate on a staggered membership, with recruitment occurring about every 18 months. And this is a great plug for us as well, as we're actually starting recruitment for the next round of members quite soon this month. So if you want to learn more, or you know someone who might be interested, or you want to share this call, feel free to also visit our website at the link below to learn a little bit more about that. In terms of the initiatives, I won't even list all of them, as there's been so many things that the Public Advisory Council has provided input and guidance on. But some of the key strategies that we'll talk about today is our data videos that they've provided insight on, as well as public-facing communications like our ICS-specific flyers. Now, as I said, we want to try to keep things engaging today and interesting. So I want to first show this, and it'll be an exercise we'll do a little bit later in the presentation. But basically, this is a challenge to all of you. You know, how do you make this very detailed research finding readable and potentially tweetable? So something that's written in more plain language and a little bit more user-friendly. So we'll also paste this finding into the chat so you can kind of see it throughout the presentation. Maybe you want to have a Word document open on the side as you listen and kind of think about how you might start to frame this in plain language. This also is not a true research finding, but I think it's probably true in the last few years, actually. So think about that as we kind of go forward. From there, we want to launch into 2 Zoom polls. And this is just kind of get a baseline level of knowledge to understand where you're at in terms of KT and IKT, as well as digital media. So Ben's going to go ahead, and he launched the first poll here for everybody. So we'll just give you a few minutes to enter your responses for this. Great, I see a lot of responses coming through. And the question was, you can probably see it on your screen, in what ways have you put knowledge into action as part of a research project? So diffusion of knowledge, which would be like a more passive sharing, knowledge transfer and dissemination, which is maybe a bit more active and targeted, knowledge mobilization and implementation, and or I don't know, or I haven't really put knowledge into action. Great, so it looks like almost everyone has replied. So I'm just gonna share those results. Perfect, thanks, Ben. So pretty mixed here, actually. Looks like the majority, about half the audience has used this for kind of an active targeted distribution of findings, which is great. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there are some people who, haven't done this before, which is totally fine. That's kind of what this workshop is all about. So maybe we'll go ahead and launch the second poll, which is just going to ask you if you've used digital media in your knowledge translation strategy. So yes, I have. No, I have not. What is digital media? Or I think I have, but hoping to get more clarity on how to use digital media in other ways. So we'll give a few seconds for people to enter. Great. Again, looking quite mixed. So we can go ahead and share those results. Perfect. So once again, it's pretty across the board, but actually a lot of people are saying, I think I've used digital media, but really hoping to get more clarity on how to use digital media in other ways. And you come to the right place for that. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today. It's great. Thank you so much. And maybe I will now advance ahead. And I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Sabella, who's going to talk a little bit more about end of grant KT versus integrated KT. So Sabella, I'm going to hand over control to you.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I'm hoping all of this works. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. So I'm just going to make sure my slides are advancing. Okay, there we go. Okay, so just going back to the first poll, if you've answered any of the options that we provided, and even if you don't know if you've participated in some form of knowledge translation activity, you may have done something before, but you just didn't know what you called it, which has happened to me in the past. But as you can see here, there are many different terms used to describe these processes throughout the period and in terms of moving knowledge to action. And McGibbon and colleagues have identified more than 100 terms for research use. So implementation, research utilization, diffusion, knowledge transfer, mobilization, etc. And although the term itself, knowledge translation, is quite new, these processes are quite old. They've transcended many sectors before. So you might have participated and you didn't even really know what it was. So knowledge translation, it's thrown around so often, and we thought that before we even get to the products, we really wanted to ground this a little bit in why we're doing this in the first place. And so we do like to pull from that CIHR definition, which is all encompassing. It really, spells out what is knowledge translation and what it should involve. But I'll tell you, whenever I hear this definition and whenever I deliver it, I feel like it goes over like this, where, you hear about that dynamic iterative process that includes all these different pieces. But by the time you get to the end of that definition, it's like it's floated over. So for today's purposes, we will keep it simple as closing the gaps from knowledge to practice and simply just using what we know to inform what we do. So in terms of those knowledge gaps that we're always talking about, the literature has pretty much defined what those gaps are. And ideally, traditionally, what has happened in the past is that knowledge has been produced in these silos. So within biomedical research, clinical science, and have taken sometimes as much as 17 years to really get to those points where they're needed the most or can be used the best. And so what that has created over time are these knowledge gaps where knowledge pretty much goes to die, and we call those the valleys of death in knowledge translation. And so again, those gaps that result from that are as a result of knowledge production problems where knowledge users and stakeholders aren't fully embedded, so the knowledge isn't necessarily applicable, or knowledge transfer, where it's just not shared or shared at the right time in environments or to knowledge users that need to use it. And so the two approaches that you hear about, end of grant KT and integrated KT, they're meant to address those problems. And so integrated KT is meant to address the knowledge gap issue, and then end of grant KT is meant to address the knowledge transfer issue. And I'll get a little bit into that. So before I talk about each one, I just wanted to mention a few key ingredients. Whether it doesn't matter which approach you take, you'll be finding or needing these key ingredients for both methods. So again, starting from your knowledge users, who you're targeting, why you're targeting, and what is your goal for those knowledge users, what in terms of what key messages and knowledge themes you're focused on, and then how. So are you using layered strategies, resources, and expertise? And so I'm not going to go into all of these in detail because Laura does cover that a little bit in the presentation. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of end of grant KT and integrated KT. And so for integrated KT, you're really focusing on how you're going to communicate your research findings at the end of the research process. And there are no cons to planning for dissemination using an end of grant KT plan. In fact, we recommend it. So thinking through your target audience goals, message, strategies, and what resources you have available. And by rule of thumb, all research proposals should have an end of grant KT plan. Now, integrated KT is a little bit more intricate. So this is where you're really designing a co-creative process that includes knowledge users throughout your research process. So from the research idea to the research findings. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of questions that you might ask yourself if you're planning such a process. So from the very beginning, do you know who your knowledge users are? Will they have defined roles in the process? And having an advisory committee is one such way of having a defined process with defined roles for your knowledge users. Is the research question a knowledge user identified priority? And you can find examples of this within the literature or gray literature. Did they inform the research plan? Will they inform the data collection process? Have they contributed to designing the data collection tools? Will they inform analysis or interpretation of results? And then in terms of your knowledge translation activities, have they informed that KT plan? And not only have they informed, are they well placed? So if we're thinking about impact, are your knowledge users suitable to the research that you're doing? And are they well placed within the system to help to put those research findings into action? So unlike end of grant KT, integrated knowledge translation is not necessarily a good fit, but it does really work when you have everything set up and those key ingredients for success. So a research that is well established, has a good knowledge base, aligns with knowledge user priorities, where relationships with knowledge users are developed, and where the process can be co-created and knowledge users can have a sense of that ownership. It's more likely that the knowledge will be used in practice. In terms of when it's not a good fit, so preliminary results, pilot projects, small studies, small sample sizes, evidence base that just is not justified for application as yet, or the knowledge base is not wide enough. These are all reasons why we would not want a knowledge integrated process as yet. And so just a few tips for you to remember. And so with that, I do believe, Laura, I'm going to hand this back to you. There we go. And I believe I share my screen now because we do move on to is it the Menti Meter?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. And I'm going to enter the link into the chat. So if anyone is not familiar with Menti Meter, you can either use your phone or your computer, click on this link, and it should direct you to a quick poll that we're going to do. Again, this is kind of an open-ended question. So sharing the screen. So basically we're asking, what have you used digital media for in the past, or what would you like to use it for in the future? Great, and responses are already coming up. So someone's saying patient engagement, YouTube for education. Oh, that's interesting. Data dashboards, yep, that's a great example. Sharing published papers, interactive reporting tools, online learning modules, publication dissemination, yeah, so few people using it for that approach. Newsletters, that's a great one as well. Articles, published manuscripts again. So yeah, a lot of people using it for kind of a dissemination approach, exchanging research ideas, education. Perfect. Great, so as you can see, there's a lot of different ways you can use digital media. And not just for kind of one approach. As Sabella was mentioning, you can use it in an integrated KT way. Maybe you're using it for recruitment, or it could be end of grant where you're actually kind of promoting some of your research studies or your findings. So that's great. Perfect. So maybe what we'll do now, I'm going to share my screen once again. And we'll jump back into a little bit about digital media, kind of written content. Oops, I think I can share that. Yeah, one moment. Share my screen again. There we go. Perfect. So as we kind of jump into this section, you may be wondering, what is digital written content? And actually it can be a variety of things. Even as you saw, like the different ways that people have used digital media and digital written content can mean a lot of different things. So essentially, digital written content is any information shared through a digital device or a screen. And so there's a few examples I have on the slide here. It could be blogs, web pages, one-pagers or flyers, infographics, plain language summaries, or social media posts. And I just included one example here that we developed in terms of kind of a digital written content example, which is ICES one-page flyers. So just to give the public a more in-depth understanding of what we do at ICES, as well as what is our health administrative data. So this was an example of some digital written content that was shared through our social media as well as our webpage. And really what I'll talk about today is I'm going to kind of break down the key considerations for writing digital written content. Now there's a lot of considerations that go into anytime you're making something like a product that's this kind of content. And we'll kind of use an analogy of going on a journey, because it really is a journey to creating this content. And after we kind of go through these steps, we'll also then hear from our Public Advisory Council members. And essentially we ask them one simple question, which is, what would you want other researchers to know when they're creating this content? So I'll go through the steps first, and then we'll hear from our members. So the first step on the journey is really the purpose and goal. So I've kind of used the analogy here, essentially, where are you going, and is this journey even right for you? So as we kind of heard from Sabella, there's two main strategies you could use digital written content for. You could do an end of grant knowledge translation approach or an integrated knowledge translation approach. And again, this kind of might depend on what your ultimate goal is, what the purpose of your product is, and it may look quite different between the two strategies. So an integrated knowledge translation, maybe you have a web page or blog created by patients as part of an intervention, or even to help with your recruitment strategy. For end of grant KT, it may look like infographics, flyers, as exactly what we saw in the Menti Meter poll, ways that you can actually promote your research and your findings. And it may also just be kind of plain language summaries or sharing on social media. So really, when you decide, what approach are you using, there's kind of two things you may also want to consider, which is accessibility and influence. So depending on your audience, who you're trying to target, sometimes journal articles and conference presentations can be inaccessible for non-academics. So if you're really trying to focus more on a public perspective, you might want to think about accessibility, and also even if you're trying to reach a more rural audience or those of a lower socioeconomic status, you may also want to consider that digital media may not be the most accessible approach. Not everyone has high-speed internet, access to a smartphone, and the ability to download these resources. So you may want to also think about creating hard copies as well. And then in terms of influence, again, thinking about, do your findings have potential to influence policies, practices, or decision-making on a larger scale? You may also want to think about how you can create a product to reach those audiences of decision makers. So next step on your journey would really be thinking about the audience and the rationale. So essentially in our analogy, step two, who's coming with you on your journey? So there could be potentially 3 audiences you could be creating your digital media product for. Maybe it's the general public, maybe it's knowledge users like community organizations or clinicians, or maybe it's policymakers. And essentially what we want you to take away here is that depending on which audience you're targeting your digital written content for, it could look very different. And you want to kind of think about the characteristics of these different populations and also where do they usually get their sources of information. That will help you not only when you create your product, but also when you go to disseminate later. And there's a great resource that I'll also refer to a little bit later on that kind of breaks down some of the characteristics of each of these audiences. And that's Making Data Talk. It's a guidebook by cancer.gov. It's a really great resource for more information as well. The next step, step 3, is kind of thinking about your message, your structure, and your format. So the analogy I use here is step 3, how are you getting there to your destination? So think about the ways that you present your content and message. And because at ICES, we talk a lot about data and we use data quite a bit, I wanted to give you a few quick tips when actually presenting your data, especially to more of a public audience. So number 1, should your data be presented? And what I mean by that is your data clear or could it potentially cause confusion? For example, if your product wouldn't be able to tell the whole story, either because it's too short or you're just giving quick snippets of findings, you may want to ask yourself, will presenting the data in isolation actually lead to more confusion? So just something to think about depending on what product you're going with. I also want to highlight cognitive processing. So basically, sometimes there's a limited capacity to process large amounts of information at any one time. And a great example of this is the 7-digit telephone numbering system. So this was originally based on research suggesting that people can optimally retain about 7 discrete pieces of information at one time, plus or minus 2. So I thought that's really helpful to think about as well. When you're presenting data, how much data are you actually including and how much will really be absorbed, especially if it's something that you want people to take away. Proportions versus percentages. So sometimes familiar metrics are key to greater understanding. So thinking about if you want to say, 23% of people have, a certain condition, it may be more advantageous to say about 1 in 4. It's just a little bit more relatable, especially if you're presenting this to a public audience, than something a little bit more arbitrary like 23%, which can sometimes be hard to quantify. Proximity of elements. So again, depending on your product, maybe you're doing kind of a web page, you may want to think about the visual fields and the proximity of different elements. So oftentimes people tend to perceive items that are close to each other in a visual field as somehow related. So if that's not the case, if you don't want people to kind of make that association between 2 elements, you may want to think about where you're actually placing them on the page. And then finally, as I mentioned, a really great resource again that goes into all these points and much, much more is Making Data Talk. It's a great workbook and it will really give you some great tips as well if you're doing data visualizations and thinking about how to present this data. Number 4, just thinking about budget and technical resources. So the analogy here is, what's your travel budget? So there's kind of 4 key things we've put, and it's just more or less a reminder of what you might need to think about as you're creating content. So not only just the financial budget in terms of, how much will it cost to create a project if you are going to outsource to a vendor, but you may also want to think about staffing time. There's a lot of content writing that goes into these kinds of products. There's a lot of review, especially if you're involving partners. And you may want to think about kind of compensation for potential partners as well. So it's not just the financial of creating, but also the time putting in from staff. You also potentially want to think about a reputable vendor, someone who's kind of maybe created similar content before, particularly if it's for health research. And for those at ICES, you can always come to the Public Engagement and Knowledge Translation Office. We have some vendors that we use and can help recommend as well. Again, thinking about partners, do you want to include potentially a partner's logo? That can really sometimes help with buy-in depending on who you're including or targeting this product to. And again, kind of goes along with that is timelines. So ultimately you want to think about when would you like this product released? And then is it reasonable to have all the content, the design, any reviews and approvals by that time? So something to definitely start early and kind of think about. And Sabella will actually give you a little bit of a case study with a video that we created and how timelines comes into play. Finally, the last step on your journey is a layered approach and using metrics. So basically what we're asking is, step 5, an analogy, how will you document your trip? So thinking a little bit about how will you measure if your digital media written content was actually effective, and how will you actually start to promote and disseminate it using potentially a layered approach of many different ways. Oftentimes we may, make a product and we might just put it on the website and kind of walk away. But it's really about thinking of a multi-layered plan. Can you share it on, through a partner's social media page? Do they have a listserv that you can distribute it through? Can you create kind of a whole social media strategy where you're sharing it on Facebook, Twitter? Maybe you're doing paid advertisement if it's for recruitment. And then also even thinking about aligning it with certain calendar days. Maybe if it's something related to heart health, for example, you could promote in the month of February, kind of link up with certain events. And then of course, metrics and evaluation are always important if you want to know how effective you are at reaching who you wanted to reach. So some final thoughts here. Again, as I mentioned, metrics, there's quite a few here that you could ultimately measure. And a lot of this is really helpful with digital media now, like things like Google Analytics make this really simple to see who's visiting your website, how many page hits are you having. Same with a blog. If you create that, you can see how many visits you're getting, product downloads, or email opens. If you're sending this through a listserv on MailChimp, for example, you can actually see who clicked to open your email. Also, social media impressions and engagement, really thinking about not only who saw your social media, but who did people actually engage, comment, like. And then ultimately, you can also think about survey feedback. If it was a tool you created that might be, you wanted to do more iterations, you could create a survey to gather feedback. And I just want to leave you with kind of a key finding from a knowledge translation systematic review. And basically they found that strategies that showed the evidence of most effectiveness really were combined, frequent, and intense over time. So exactly what we're saying in terms of a layered approach, it's kind of thinking about multiple ways that you can share this content. So with that, I would like to hand it over to 2 members of our Public Advisory Council, Alaki and Jenny, who've created some fantastic content in their own words that they would like to present to you to get you thinking about what also might be important, again, from their perspective that we have not already talked about. So I will hand it over to Alaki and Jenny.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Ben, if you could just launch the poll that I have there. And then I guess share the results of the poll whenever there are results. So because we're talking about reading text, I wanted to talk a little bit about the general public in Ontario and just some information about their literacy abilities. So you in this group probably have your own preferences for how you like to receive information. And the general public has their own preferences. So I'm guessing probably most of the people in the group this morning are highly literate and often prefer and find it more efficient to find information through reading. So I don't know if you have feedback from people or if people are quick at responding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so most people are going to look it up in English, and a good chunk or some are going to look it up in their first language. Okay, so you guys are readers, and most Ontarians are not. So if we could switch to the next slide, please. If you think about people in your community who don't prefer reading, You may not always know it. I know for me, although I work in the literacy space, I didn't realize that a lot of my very fluent in English, born in Ontario friends struggled with reading until the advent of the smartphone. And I would send, a paragraph long message and I wouldn't hear anything back for, a while. And then I'd get a phone call. And after this happened a few times, I said, oh, would you prefer me to just call you? And yes, the answer was yes. And this was a friend of mine who spent most of his childhood in hospital, sort of semi-sedated and recovering. And it was also friends of mine who had been, really bullied terribly in school. And it's difficult to learn literacy or any other skills when you're kind of living in terror. And so people who you may not expect can find it really an uphill battle to read even a simple amount of text. They'll put it off until tomorrow, and it can just be really slow. And that is a chunk of Ontario. Let's see. Another group, 30% of people in Ontario were born outside Canada and 40% of the GTA were born outside Canada. It doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't very proficient in English, but it can often create a preference for just quickly looking things up in their first language. It's just an easier go-to. And so those folks, it's important to consider, like we'll talk a little bit later about how to kind of include those people when you're trying to share information. If you were sponsored to come to Canada, there's a 45% chance that you didn't speak English or French when you arrived. And for refugees, again, the smallest number of people who are new to Canada, and the group that I work with, about 60% have no English or French when they arrive. People learn quickly and they do develop their proficiency over time. But to get to the point where you're in the 14% of Ontarians who can comfortably read 2 long texts and synthesize a conclusion, that's what it means to be advanced. If you can read 2 long texts and synthesize a conclusion, you are advanced. And there's only 14% of us in the province who can comfortably do that. Ilakia has some more advice about this point on how to include people, particularly with digital media. Ilakia, if you want to unmute yourself, and it's all yours.
Sure. Laura, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is one of the graphs that were presented regarding COVID-19 trends. So I want to ask, does anyone think this is accessible data? So as you kind of process that, I want to give you my 2 cents. So as someone with a post-secondary education, it takes me a while to process this information, mostly because the 2 of the y-axes that are here, and then the 4 different types of data that are presented in this one graph. And, personally, I actually remember over the pandemic, tuning into the news often to see what the COVID-19 trends are over like the past few weeks. And we were presented with like 2, 3 of these graphs. And I remember feeling overwhelmed. And this wasn't only because I was processing this new information, but this visual tool that was supposed to be helpful for me was actually making it difficult for me to process the different moving parts. And I would often like tune into the news with my parents, and I remember that they would like kind of stop me and be like, oh, like, what are they saying? Can you explain these different parts? And, they speak English, they know English, but this information was not necessarily accessible to them just because they weren't presented with graphs in the past, and that's not how they are used to be processing this information. And I anticipate that this is the case in many, many households across Ontario, whether it be in understanding like COVID-19 rates, vaccination efficiency information, information on like the importance of mental health, or recognizing the benefits of exercise. And the general audience only benefits from research and findings when the information that they have is accessible, convenient, and available to them. And the current presentation of data kind of aims to summarize this information. And although this busy graph does a great job of doing that, it may actually be pulling the public or scaring them away from research. Next slide, please, Laura. So I invite you to think about knowledge translation as a social media post. So if we were tweeting something or posting a picture on Instagram, we don't have a lot of time to capture people's attention. And aside from not having enough time, it's also important to recognize that people are generally unwilling to dedicate large chunks of time to reviewing and interacting with posts. So we post a quick tweet or a picture to capture people's attention, and maybe they'll follow up with it, right? So if that engages them. So this is what kind of makes social media work. The limited attention and energy that we have to receive the information that's available to us on social media makes it easy, available, accessible, and convenient to us in our daily lives. So I think the knowledge translation is similar. So when disseminating knowledge to the general public who are at different literacy levels, lead busy lives, researchers should think about it as a headline. We only have this headline to capture people's attention. So an image, a headline, a few words is what we have. And the goal is to present the information in a concise way so the reader is able to digest this information within the next minute or so. Next slide, please, Laura. So these are a few examples of news reports, recent ones, that describe research. So just at first glance, the main findings of these studies are revealed. So we're quickly able to understand that the first little clip here suggests that 7 hours of sleep is important for people in their adulthood. And the fourth one kind of discusses the potential of leveraging brain scans to really understand mental illnesses. So I encourage you as researchers to think about how you can provide the reader with key findings in a digestible manner to help remove the barriers from a reader's perspective and promote the knowledge of your research within the public. And I'll pass it back to Jenny.
Thank you. So there's a few recommendations here. I'll just share from my own experience. When we went into lockdown, again, I mentioned that I worked with adult refugees who have, limited, again, not everybody, but a good number have very limited computer literacy, limited numeracy, limited literacy. How did we share information with them when the only tool that they have is usually a phone number, usually a smartphone. Smartphone is essential to folks when they first arrive because they need a phone number to get their ID. And by far, people wanted WhatsApp groups because there's no login. You just start getting messages and you can record your questions and you can hear answers in auditory form. Second choice to that was Facebook. Most people have a Facebook account and people definitely preferred to receive information through Facebook. Those were the two lowest barrier to entry tools that people preferred. For people who are extremely literate in their first language and have high, post-secondary plus education, making sure that the text is copy and pastable. Because when you present things in a PDF where you can't copy and paste, often AI can't translate it for you. A lot of people use AI just to help them navigate and get information rapidly. And so when things are in photo form, AI can't really access it. And I think that's basically what I have to say. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you both, Jenny and Alakia. That was very insightful, and I think really helpful also to take those pieces we talked about and actually put them into kind of a more realistic thought and what might be considered when you're actually kind of implementing this. So that was fantastic. So now I will hand it over back to my colleague Sabella. So you've absorbed this information, you've heard from members of our Public Advisory Council. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and actually look at, if you're making a video, what's a case study about how that all came together and what you might need to consider. So I'll pass control back over to you, Sabella.
Thank you, Laura. Okay. All right, so we've heard, had quite a bit of mouthful already. We have talked about all the whys. We've gone through some examples of digital written media. We've even kind of had an introduction to layering, and I'm going to bring out a little bit of that in this. So, okay, what's wrong with this slide? Sorry, these slides sometimes. Oh, there we go. So yeah, so what I've done here is I've put together a laundry list of best practices for using videos as a KT strategy. And I know we've had quite a bit of this, but in addition to that, we thought that, you know, embedding these best practices in what our own experience was, you know, the highs and some of the lows of that experience might be quite useful for you. So what you're going to see is, you know, all of those important ingredients. So purpose and goal, knowing your audience, knowing your knowledge themes, message structure and format, budget and technical resources, and then all of those pieces about audio scripts, like how, you know, the use and how they were littered throughout our process in the next few slides. So what I've done here is sort of create like a board game of our journey to the data videos, and that little icon serendipitously looks like Laura. We didn't intend it, but it does look like Laura kind of running through the process. So yeah, so at the very beginning, what we started off with, oh, I'm sorry, I realized, oh, I did have a little video. So this is just, can you hear this? Can anybody hear this?
I think I have to enable the sound, so one moment, I will do
Okay,
that.
yes. So it's just a little snippet of the data video. And so Laura's just gonna pop that on for me.
We'll start again.
If it's problematic, that's fine. I'm gonna attach the entire video in the slides that are shared so everyone can have a look, but it would be nice to get a snippet if we're able to.
It should go now.
Welcome to More Than Numbers, a series presented by ICES where we're going to take a deeper look into how data is used to answer important healthcare questions in Ontario. Since 1992, the Ontario government has entrusted ICES with securely holding and analyzing its health administrative data to evaluate and improve Ontario's health system. Our researchers use a vast and secure array of health-related data to answer key questions to improve the health of Ontarians.
Okay, so yeah, so just a quick introduction to the data videos. Oh, okay, there we go. So before we even got to the video, I think there's a little bit of feedback. Laura, are you getting that? Okay, yeah, so before we even got to the videos, we started thinking through some of those key elements, and we, you know, purpose and goals, audience and messaging, and you know, before even thinking about the products, there were, you know, just the need. Was there a need for the videos? And there was. So there was organizational priority was established, but even before that, we had a call from the public through, you know, individual calls, like from members of the public and even from our PAC, that they didn't know a lot of things about ICES. So simple things like, you know, what was administrative data to the processes that we had to how data even reached, you know, ICES, data, ICES's role as a data steward, and also, you know, how that data is transformed into, you know, research that can inform the public. So there was a need. And so we knew from the very get-go that our goal was to create awareness about some of these themes that were brought out from the public themselves. So once we established the purpose and goals, we knew, I think our main audience was the members of the public, but we also wanted to create something that would also be applicable to not-for-profits, policymakers, researchers, people that we often, you know, that work within our realm and that we partner with. And then our knowledge themes stemmed from those very questions. So what was administrative data? Where does it come from? How is it generated? ICS is a data steward. And then using some key pieces of research or research programs to tell the story of what ICS does. That was ultimately what we're trying to do. And so as you can tell, it was quite a bit of information that we needed to get out there and to a broad group of audience. And so around this point, we already knew a video might be most suitable, something that could be ongoing, that we can refresh over time, and that, you know, would just get to that general awareness that we were trying to get to. In terms of budget and resources, we had financial support through ICS resources and OHDP. And then we also use some of that to get specific supports around getting a graphic and animation designer. So we had those pieces in place. Now, our first, this brings us to our first snag, timeline. And Laura has mentioned timeline before, and this is so important, and I really wanted to highlight it because you'll see how it really kind of cascaded throughout our process and created some issues. So timeline is a key, ingredient, best practice, but we did have tight timelines that affected some of those best practices that would have been present within the production, the pre-production and production components. And so I'm going to just highlight a little bit of those. So we've gone through preparation, and now we're on to pre-production. And so again, we're back to the best practices around structure, format. We not only wanted to do videos, but animated videos because we thought it would be a little bit more interactive. Our videos were going to be a little bit longer, 5 to 8 minutes, because there were so many knowledge themes to kind of map through it. And we developed a script outline. And we also utilized sections within the videos that focused on those different knowledge themes and sort of created a story structure from our own projects that we had ongoing. The other very important point is that we consulted with our PAC during this preparation and pre-production phase, and they had a look at the concept and sort of what we had mapped out in terms of a script outline, and had very valuable tips on making the videos and making them more public friendly. And our two valued members, Pierre and Dave, are going to shed some light on this a little bit more. So then this leads us to, bane of our existence, the timeline, and what that started to kind of cascade into. We didn't have enough time to do a full script, and what we did was that script outline. But how that sort of affected the process, that we ended up having a little bit more ad hoc recordings, longer videos, less. We had to move from complex to less complex animations, and this increased the editing time during the production phase. So it didn't stop us. We continued to move forward, and we're on to production. And here are some best practices. Again, good video quality gives you good videos. Good audio and sound gives you good videos. So these are elements you want to have that are key to the production phase. And again, the bane of our existence, that timeline. And also, I mean, by no means of our control, COVID. So we had to do Zoom videoing rather than on-site videoing, just because everyone was kind of dispersed. And then the tight timelines plus the longer videos and less time to re-record, again, increased the editing time because we had a lot more little hitches that we had to fix before we got to that final product. Anyway, the good news is that despite all of those, we did reach the final videos. They're a bit longer than anticipated, but I vouch a lot for the robust promotions plan that we put together along with the comms department. And so again, stressing on that layered approach. And so someone once advised, resist the urge to pack all of your knowledge into one product and utilize a layer approach wherever you can. So for us, we had the full videos. But what we did also, we created the shorter clips like the one that you just saw. And then we utilized our own internal ICES communication and then ICES events like this one to promote our videos. And then we also utilized some of our internal, external partners with whom we also had a bit of collaboration with creating the videos. And just to give you a snippet on how effective that layered approach can be, for us, we had the simple goal of creating awareness. So looking at views, likes, shares, comments, impressions, those were the metrics we're using. So we tested just having a passive promotion. So putting them on YouTube, the long videos. And I kid you not, we got around, I would say 2 to 5 videos per week. If we were lucky, maybe 1 per month if we were lucky in terms of views. When we did active layer promotion where we combined, social media along with the clips, along with a good tweet or slogan attached to the YouTube video, we had about for the video clips maybe 166 to 200 per week. So after 6 months, a little over 4,000 views within that 6 months period. And it kind of fed back to the full length videos where we were looking at 30 to 40 views per week after a 6 month period. And so this is where I say that the layered approach to your promotions plan can really galvanize your entire product and how you get it out there to your users. And so before I hand you over to Pierre and Dave, I'm just going to give you a snippet of one of the clips that we tested that really hit the viewership. And this was one that I focused on a segment from the COVID video with Jeff Kwong. So I'm just going to click this open here. Hopefully it loads. And it's probably not going to load, but we probably had our luck with the first clip. Oh, there it goes. Sorry for that.
What happens after one of us takes a COVID-19 test? Where does that information go? Can you describe the journey of the data from a person taking a COVID test to ICES?
So what happens is people can get tested in a whole bunch of different places. So they can go to a COVID assessment center, emergency department or hospital, a nursing home, a family doctor's office, or pharmacy. So all these places where people can get a COVID test, they have to be sent off to a lab to actually get tested. And then we have to collect the data from the labs. In addition, if someone tests positive for COVID, public health will contact that person and collect additional data, which is part of a process called case management and contact tracing. And so we also bring that data into ICES as well. And we put it all together to see who's been tested and who's tested positive for COVID.
Okay, so no, it doesn't want to stop. Okay.
One of us takes a COVID-19 test. Where does that information go? Can you describe the journey
All right.
of the data from a person taking a COVID test to ICES?
All righty there. Okay, sorry about that, little technical difficulties. I'm going to try to advance this. I think sometimes when I click, it starts. Okay, yes, so just to close this off and to hand you over to Dave and Pierre, are we finished? No, we're not. We do have quite a bit we have to work on with these types of products and our strategies in general. In the future, we'd love to do some more focus group testing and improve on the metrics that we collect. So not just awareness, but try to zone in on, who's using our product, where are they using it, knowledge gain, how useful was the product. Those are some strategies that we do want to embed in the future. And I'm going to hand you over now to our two very valued members of the pack as well, Dave and Pierre, who will shed some insights on this process and some tips as well for what you might consider if you're going to go the route of doing videos. So Laura, I'm just going to hand this back to you. Okay, is that okay? Yep. All right, and I'm going to mute.
Sure. Great. So I'm just going to hand it now over to Pierre and Dave and give a little bit more on their insights in terms of, again, what researchers should think about when they're preparing perhaps more of either digital media in general or video content.
Hi, how is everyone? Pierre.
I'm here. I'm here.
That's good. Okay, I'll start off then. I'm from an older generation that predates a lot of the digital products and digital media, but we did have presentations. There's always, this is really what you're doing. You're presenting information and knowledge to transfer it to an audience. One of the things that when you're making a video or any kind of presentation is really, to know the scope of what you're doing, that it's not too large, and the audience. So I always found that if the audience, if it's a lot of information and the audience is from a background of academics, it's easier to use, more intense type of information that they can absorb. On the other hand, if you're dealing with non-academic or general audience and the size is getting larger, now I use some graphics in here where you talk about the audience in your case maybe through through the screen. You don't know who and what their role is, if they're academic, non-academic. So you have to accommodate that. And then the audience size gets bigger. You may be dealing with just a supposed room full of people, and then you get a huge audience that may be equivalent to an auditorium. So in this case, this is something that you want to make sure that that your information is being transferred in a way that they can understand, and you know that the size of the group is. I always found when it was a lot of good information applicable to what I was doing, I would really like the smaller approach and the more intense and higher level types of information. I don't know, Pierre, you got anything you want to talk about this? How's it been for you?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm from Sudbury, and many people think Sudbury is Northern Ontario. It's actually Central Ontario. But in terms of the approach you take with the size of the group that you have, I think you have to also consider the cultural and linguistic background of the people that you're dealing with in terms of the approach to the presentation that you're going to make. And I'll talk about some other aspects of that a little bit later on in our slide presentation.
Okay, I was going to go on about the one big no-no that I saw repeated over and over again is this jargon and acronym use. And I think when we started with the pack, we found them using a lot of acronyms that we didn't really know, or where they're just so used to it in their work environment, they really have to bring us up to speed. So if you're giving, know your audience. If you're giving this kind of information out, try and minimize that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dave.
Yeah.
My involvement began as a completely non-data type person on the PAC committee. And my very first meeting, the acronyms were being thrown out there left and right. And I felt there was a strange language that I didn't know. And I actually had to ask them to provide me with a sheet of all of the acronyms that attached to the usage of these acronyms within the context of ICES. And there's a full sheet that I received. And it was quite an experience to then, after time, of course, you start to understand what these acronyms mean. But at the outset, I felt like a deer in the headlights, to be honest with you.
Yeah, exactly. I was the same. And I think what the other thing I was going to mention is the use of specific analogies and visuals to audience specific. So if you're trying to get I always found it helpful, even in the pre-digital days, that if you give some kind of analogy to what you're trying to present, the information and knowledge you're trying to give people, I found that a good graphic in this case works. I was going to mention that I came from the days of the overhead projector. So there wasn't too many graphics. There was a lot of text, and it was difficult sometimes that it would be a verbal type of analogy. But I think nowadays, if you're doing a video, putting these kinds of graphics in, plus charts, anything like that, any kind of visual that will help get your knowledge transferred to the audience. Pierre?
I agree. Now, the inference, of course, this is premised upon digital accessibility and signal accessibility. It might surprise you to know, and perhaps not, that there are many dead zones in Northern Ontario, even past Sudbury. And as an example, a few days ago, I was about an hour north of Sudbury visiting my son, who was at an isolated campsite on a bush road. And when he drove me back to where I had parked the car, which was also on a bush road, he dropped me off, waved goodbye, and as he was leaving in a cloud of dust, I turned around and realized that I had a flat tire. I had no signal. I couldn't call him to say, come back and give me a hand. And I eventually fixed it on my own and was able to leave. but it's surprising for many people to know that these dead zones exist, and despite multiple indications that the problem will be resolved, it's yet to be resolved. So I'd ask you to think about those communities that are even further north. If you travel along the Highway 11 corridor from Cochrane all the way through to Thunder Bay, there are many isolated communities. If you travel on the 129 highway, there are many isolated communities with very limited internet access. So keep in mind that we're talking about a digital access situation here, but there may be circumstances where the research project you're dealing with has a more rural flavor to it. And so if you're going to attempt to have that interactivity with your audience, you may have to consider methods other than digital to interact with that audience. Classic example, the communities along Hudson's Bay, you know, very limited access there.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, we're talking about in this case, again, when you're doing your video, and Sabella touched on all the technical aspects. I know I'm not good at the technical parts of these things, but I do know from a audience participation, you know, what I need to do. And in this case, you want to make your digital connections through events, programs, and individual outreach with the policymakers and other stakeholders who can use your research. I think this is kind of what we're doing here in this particular presentation, that you want to expand your network and support evidence-based decision-making and the adoption of this new information. I think this is what you're trying to do. Most people have a desire to know, and of course, if you're looking for funding or grants, this is something that you have to ensure that you increase your audience size. I don't know if Pierre, is there anything that you want to say about that or about?
Well, I think how you follow up with your stakeholders is an important consideration. And again, I know we're talking about it in a digital media context, but I just want to step back a minute, because for me, and I don't think it's a misnomer to say that in this day and age, there's a general mistrust about dissemination of information, especially from sources of authority. And I think the idea is, how do we get past that mistrust? Well, I'd like to suggest to those who are involved in research that you have to establish that trust with your audience. You have to have transparency, and that transparency has to continue from the get-go all the way through to the end result. And for that transparency to take place there, you have to use plain language in terms of the explanations and audience that you're dealing with. I call it the TTP principle. But the idea being that if you put all the work at the front end of the exercise, the end result will ultimately show a quality product. But nonetheless, you have to ensure that your audience is engaged and fully understanding of all the different steps that led to that quality product. So it's really important for it to have good interaction and transparency throughout the process that you're engaging in.
True, very good. Talk about acronyms, Pierre. TTP, what was that?
Trust, transparency, plain language. Trust equals transparency equals plain language.
Okay, I like that. That's good. Okay, I'm going to talk about data right now. And I know in my days of dealing with data, I never really thought about who owns the data, the privacy and things like that. But when you're dealing with health data, that's definitely something that you have to be aware of. Research involves data. And then I said data involves ownership. Someone owns that data. And and it means that there's privacy associated with that. So I think when you're doing any type of, if you're dealing with data and that's part of your video, and explain to the audience that the data source ownership and the privacy is involved. In other words, who owns the data? How long does it exist for? Who has access to it? And really, I think you have to ensure that the people, the audience, understand that this is not a big black box that anybody can just plug into and get some information, that this data is owned, and there's privacy rules around it, that you cannot disseminate anything that's of a private nature.
I agree, Dave. And in one of the polls that Laura asked you to engage in, one of the explanations as to why you wanted to do this was patient engagement. And that's an extremely important consideration in this day and age. I'm not about to paint everybody with the same brush, but from my point of view, that's been a weakness in the health data system, patient engagement. And if you're going to get that patient engagement and you want that patient engagement, then there has to be those clear explanations, again, that transparency about the whole issue of data. Because again, talking from my perspective and starting on the PAC committee, my eyes were open to a great extent about this whole issue of data, health data, its impact on patients, how it can be used, where there are weaknesses in the data accessibility, which may affect the results of studies. These are all things that patients need to understand, perhaps not fully from a full research perspective, but they need to have a general idea about this whole concept of health data. How does it impact me? What do people do with it? What kind of health data are they taking from me? These are all things that they need to be told in a way that they understand, and they need to feel that they're involved in that process.
Yeah, that's good, Pierre. So considering the time we have left, we're just going to end up with what we call a circle of life. And really, it's explain to your stakeholders how you're going to follow up. What you have to implement a feedback loop, a process that's going to improve on your research, because really what you want to do, I mean, it's not just an end. You have to follow up, get feedback, improve your process for the next time, or for anyone else that you're assisting. So I think this is important. We put the circle of life from the Lion King, basically just to show that really there's a start, there's an end, and there's a beginning again.
And it's really important to remember that what you're doing is very important, but we want to be able to show that it's very important. And that's where your plan to present your results so that everybody's involved and you can meet the goal of affecting change or patient engagement, that's the ultimate goal.
Great.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Dave and Pierre. This was really insightful, and I think you made some great points and also very relatable too. So really appreciate you walking us through that today. Great. So just keeping an eye on the time, I know we're nearing the end and I want to ensure we have some time for questions and answers. So we'll just jump right into kind of our final section here, which is talking about dissemination. So really leveraging social media and plain language. So you may have seen at the beginning of our presentation, even if you came in late, you may wonder what this long finding was. So now we're going to start actually thinking about, have you put this into plain language on the side during our presentation? But essentially take a look at this finding, Sabella put it back in the chat, and see if you can make it a little bit more plain language. And you can start to send us your summaries. And Sabella will also include the chat to the Menti Meter poll again. But essentially, see if you can just give a stab at this, putting it in more plain language, and then we'll take a look at these results shortly as I go through the last few slides. So really, I just wanted to take you through dissemination versus diffusion. Just to kind of reiterate, diffusion is a more passive, unfocused approach, often ineffective or less effective in changing practice. Whereas that dissemination is really the targeted approach where you're using tailored messages for your particular audience, something we've talked about a lot today. Again, I think actually a lot of these points were drilled home by the members of the Public Advisory Council today, just in terms of writing plain language and thinking about social media. So I won't kind of repeat too much of what's already been said, but essentially just thinking of keeping it simple. So short words, short sentences, and short paragraphs. Again, as Dave and Pierre were mentioning, try to avoid jargon, avoid acronyms, and really be consistent in whatever terminology you're using. So if you're using the word pill in place of medication, use that throughout so it's consistent. Again, we've kind of really honed in on writing to your audience. Consider using a more conversational tone, be direct in your messaging, which is also really important if you don't have a lot of space or time. You want to think about how you can get your message across quite quickly. And Alakia talked about that in terms of kind of like that headline. So how do you get your message across briefly, but clearly and succinctly? And then in terms of social media, again, thinking about what is the need to know. Think about what you want your audience to understand versus what you want to tell them. So what's really the main message and what you want to get across. Also, you can think about social media specifically is using visuals to not only enhance the meaning, but enhance engagement. Sometimes including a picture can actually get you more comments or people viewing that post. And also you could consider tagging other organizations, other partners, and also kind of other engagement approaches, like using a survey to gauge people's responses. So to kind of finish off before we think about these plain language examples you're entering in, I want to just put something about jargon busting. So there's this tweet I saw on Twitter, and it was basically, what are words that academics use to sound smart that may not always be necessary? So there's a few answers here. So someone says, I once called the outside of a Coke can the exterior surface, so maybe not needed. Paucity is apparently a terrible word. All I hear is pause city, and I see dogs running all over the town. So instead of just saying a lack of or a little bit, maybe we don't need to say paucity. Someone says anything that requires Googling. Really, do we need to be that technical? Should just be something that you should know kind of as you're reading to avoid that extra step. Inextricably intertwined instead of just saying stuck together. This person says they're guilty of that crime. And then finally, a big one that came up in this thread was utilize versus just saying use. So again, just thinking about what's the clearest way you can get your message across without kind of getting convoluted. So I thought that was pretty helpful. The last thing I wanted to just highlight is some helpful resources. Again, Making Data Talk is a great one that I mentioned earlier. There's also tools online. The CHR has a jargon buster, St. Mike's Hospital, and then also writing health information for patients and families. So there's lots of great resources. Great, so I'm going to stop sharing. I see some responses already coming in to our Menti Meter. So let me share my screen and we can take a look. People watching more Netflix, fed up with Zoom during COVID lockdown. Oops, sorry, let me share it. I didn't realize I didn't share that. Here's what, yeah, so people watching more Netflix, fed up with Zoom during COVID lockdown. That's a great one. During the COVID pandemic, people reported that video meetings negatively impacted their quality of life, and over half spent more time watching online streaming. That's a good one too. Study finds Zoom during lockdown an exhausting experience. That's a great headline. That's probably what you would see. An increase in streaming services, exhaustion, and impact on quality of life. Just some of the impacts of using Zoom during pandemic. Oh, that's great. Netflix and chill, research shows Zoom is exhausting and half of people pulled up increased online streaming. These are great headlines. Maybe I'll just quickly ask our Public Advisory Council members, any favorites coming out that you've seen?
The Netflix and chill one, for sure.
I second the Netflix and chill, just because you're like, oh, okay, I see where we're going with this.
I like the simplicity of using Zoom as an exhausting experience for individuals in lockdown, according to research. It would pique my curiosity immediately to see exactly what that research was talking about.
Definitely. These are fantastic. I can see everyone was paying attention. These are good headlines. You thought about your audience. So that's great. And in keeping with time, I do want to make sure everyone, there's some time for question and answers. So I will stop there, but thank you so much, first of all, to all our speakers. This was really, really helpful, great content presented today. So really appreciate that. And from there, I will pause and see if you have any questions. We have a few minutes, we can take those either in the chat or you can raise your hand. But if not, thank you so much, everyone, also for taking time out of your day to attend.
I just wanted to thank Laura and Sabella. They made us look organized, and they put a lot of work behind the scenes to support us in presenting this. And I just also thanks to the scientists and researchers. We don't want you to, we know more and more and more is being asked of you. And so we just hope that what we shared with you today can help encourage the funding agencies and grant givers to understand that you need support, because this is, you are being asked to do more and more. So thank you for your science.
And if I could just add, the work that all of you do, of course, is very, very important. All we're trying to do is increase the quality and reachability of your product. And if you consider that in a private context, that's what any private enterprise wants to do. They want to reach out, get a new audience. They want to improve their product. And so kudos to your work, but let's make it even better, more interactive and simple for everyone.
Great. Well put by both of you, for sure. Thank you so much. One quick question I see is, will the presentation be available online or on the ICES website? And I think, Ben, we were just also talking about, I think this session will be recorded and posted after. And I think, Ben, you're mentioning it'll be available for a while for those who want to rewatch it. Ben says correct. So that is right. So this session will be recorded and shared after as well. I don't see any further questions in the chat or hands raised. So we can close the session from there. But again, sorry, there is one hand raised. Go ahead.
Is it okay if I verbally ask it? Because okay. So I thank you so much for the presentation. I found it really helpful and informative and really clearly laid out. One of the points that I think is really essential is around thinking about your knowledge user right from the get-go, especially in the embedded knowledge translation. And I'm thinking about my own experience in trying to engage people with lived experience around research that we were conducting, and having an eye on the product we were creating. But what my question is, and maybe it's to Jenny and others that that presented around supporting, making sure that the resources at the end are plain language. But I'm thinking more about if there's resources or advice you have about supporting those knowledge users through the research process or the project, where they might not be, comfortable with, the scientific language or the process, but their input is really valuable. But just some of the considerations to support people through the process. I think, one of the things, building into a budget to financially support people, but also like education and other types of supports to support those knowledge users through the length of a project. So it's a bit of a wide open question, but I appreciate any thoughts that you might have on that.
Thanks for your question, Karen. So knowledge users, is that like the same as like the people that you're asking questions of in a research study? Like, or you mean people Like, or do you mean like people at the end or people who?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, we often have an advisory committee. I do a lot of work with people experiencing homelessness. So, having an advisory committee to make sure that, that we're being sensitive to the issues, and just thinking about ways to make sure that they feel supported through the process. So they're not study participants. They would be, ultimately they probably come from agencies that might use the knowledge at the end, policymakers, but people like less in institutions and more with like lived experience, and just making them feel heard and respected during the process.
I think, as soon as you start putting things into a survey, right, a written survey, you've eliminated a large number of possible participants. And so the data from that group won't necessarily get captured. And certainly that's easier, right, for researchers. But in terms of, I agree, budgeting for individual supports, or even budgeting for things like a phone and a SIM card with a WhatsApp group, if that is something that people can manage, would be a way to kind of include more folks in the process, and even organize people. If people are homeless or experiencing homelessness, gather at this place at this time, right? Like, how are you going to encourage that? Like, if you don't have a means of communicating with people that doesn't necessarily require high literacy. And I'm sure Karen, yep. And Sabella,
I was going to jump in when you're finished, Jenny, but no, go ahead, finish your point.
Nope, that's it.
Oh, no, great point, Jenny. No, I was also going to jump into just to add a few tips from what we did with the Public Advisory Council. So if you're engaging, even if they're not study participants, but you're engaging members as part of your integrated process. So things like having an orientation, or creating educational plain language materials to support their knowledge, building their knowledge on the work, the specific work or the specific research terms. Those might be helpful. Having a slide deck that's tailored towards simplifying, and even if for persons who will be involved through the research process, this applies to them as well. You do need to plan around specific sessions where they will be oriented to the material and the terms and the tools, and all those pieces to help to set you up for success in an integrated process. Do these points answer your question?
I'd like to add, if I might, from my experience on the council, a few of the things that I appreciated, if we're talking about an advisory group for the purposes of a research project, was first of all, a clear goal for the group. Secondly, very clear and identified procedures for the group to follow within the context of what you're looking for as feedback from them, and also identifying the importance of it being a safe environment where all kinds of different opinions can be thrown out there without fear of repercussions. These are just some points that, based on my experience, made my involvement a much more comfortable one within the context of the Public Advisory Council.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Really good reiteration there, Pierre, too, just feeling, you want your members to feel comfortable. I don't know if that answers your question, or anyone else want to chime in on any additional thoughts.
I just wanted to talk about briefly the McMaster Health Forum, and they had I participated in a master class on the conduct and use of patient-oriented research. So if anyone's interested, they could to look at that. That was quite interesting.
That's great, really helpful. Perfect, thumbs up. Great. Well, I know the next session is starting at 11 a.m., so I don't want to hold people up. You can get a chance to refill your coffee before we get started at 11, but thank you everyone again so much. Really appreciate your time, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Peace and love.
Bye.
Bye.
you.